Hello, today I'm sitting down with Jeff Smith from Downsteam Tourist Railway and Museum in Toowoomba. Jeff is also my granddad. So, granddad, how long have you been with Downsteam?
Emma, I've been at Downsteam now for 20 years, so it's been a really good time.
And when you first got to Downsteam, what was the site like? Like, how have you seen it grow since day one?
Yeah, since day one, it was just a bare paddock with two railway tracks coming through it, all covered in grass. So it's been an ongoing thing ever since then.
How large was the team when you started versus how large is your volunteer team now?
So we probably had half a dozen people at that stage, and today we have probably 40 odd active volunteers. So it's wonderful now.
What sort of people do you have in your volunteer team? Are they mostly retired people, or do you have a lot of young people coming through because they're interested in the history?
95% would be retired people, and then there's a few that are still working, but at the end of their working life. And we have now probably a couple very younger ones in their 20s that have just come in, and they come on the weekends. So that's really good to bring a variety of people through the job.
And what is your main role there? Do you have a title?
I'm development and site manager, which I have been for the last probably 15 years. So,
And what does that entail?
it was all about the development of the site, of planning it, where things were going to go, where the station was going to go, where the eventual shed was going to go, where additional tracks were going to be laid, what we were going to, the expectations of the site, to how we wanted to be presented to the public.
So do you have a lot to do with deciding what exhibits get displayed, or is it more so the mechanical side of things?
Overall, I have able to look at all the different things that happens on the site. So it all comes to me eventually. So then we take it to a board and make decisions on what we have and what we're going to do. But as far as like down the shed and even up on the station in the general area, I'm sort of hands-on, so I know what's going on all the time.
I'll circle back to that point later on when we talk about the exhibits, and especially the Dreamtime exhibit. But for now, I want to ask you, what about railway history is special to you, and why are you passionate about trains?
Ever since a little fellow, I've been interested in trains. Rode on many trains, and then everywhere on the trains. And then as I got older, I got more interested in the trains, because where we live now, the trains go past here each day. So it was an interest in, especially on the history of the trains and the historical side of the trains, which I'm very interested in.
And I guess being from Toowoomba, how has your location gone into your search for like the history of railways? And I mean, what role does Toowoomba play in like Australian railway history?
Yeah, well, Toowoomba is very significant in the role, because it's basically a hub here of the railway, because the lines go east and west and south from here. So they've all got to come to Toowoomba to go somewhere. So the southern line comes into Toowoomba, the western line comes into Toowoomba. So, and being a major hub, it was a major part of the railway workshops and all that sort of thing here in Toowoomba.
So was Toowoomba kind of like a midway point between maybe a capital city somewhere and then like Western Queensland or inland Queensland?
Well, inland Queensland, yes, because coming from Sydney, the line comes to Toowoomba to go to Brisbane on the one that came up the tablelands through New South Wales, and then the Western line had to come through Toowoomba to get down the mountain back to Brisbane.
it's strange to think that Toowoomba would be a railway hub, considering we live on top of a hill. How much do you know about the construction of the railway up the range, and could you comment on that and the processes that were involved?
The process of building the line up here, because to come up to Toowoomba Range was a gigantic step in construction, because to go up the mountain we've got nine tunnels, and there was many bridges, and the bends and that coming up the Toowoomba Range were quite significant with the construction. But really they built the whole thing in 2 years with Labor back in the 1860s. So it's been there quite a long time now.
Yeah. Why do you think that railway history and trains are worth remembering and commemorating? Like, why is it important for society to remember that part of our history?
The railway, the trains, and that opened up the country. Before the railways came, it was just the bullock teams, and it were very slow getting produce to the markets and everything. And once the railways were established, like back in England when the railways first started, it built all the towns along the track. So here in Australia, when it started several years later, the same thing happened, where small villages were. The railways came, and that made the area prosper and grow, and it was able to get the produce down to the markets into the capital cities much quicker.
So the railways played a big part in like the development of colonial Australia and going from little colonies to be able to make a wealthy nation that was able to do things, I guess.
Yeah, it did that. It really made the economic situation of the country prosper and go forward. A lot of the lines up the Queensland coast, the main line up the Queensland coast wasn't there originally. It started from Brisbane out to Toowoomba, and then from Rockhampton west, and then from Townsville west. It wasn't until many years later that the line joined up, going right up the coast to join all those together. So that's where the railway really played the big part in establishing all those towns and areas that still exist today.
So for Australia to become economically prosperous and to start being able to produce its own things, were trains and railways essential to becoming a self-sufficient sort of country?
It certainly did there, because it set up manufacturing places there, because they could get their manufacturing goods back down to the markets, into the main areas that they wanted to, and those markets just grew, and all the areas then grew because of that manufacturing within those areas close to the railway.
And when you're talking about manufacturing in Australia, what sort of manufacturing elements and like types of manufacturing are we talking about? What was Australia producing?
Well, producing, first of all, they had to get the material to produce those, and so the trains carted the coal and all the other products to go into the manufacturing. And from the manufacturing, like when they made the steel and that, they carted the steel then to the other manufacturing places to make products like here in Toowoomba, of all the industry that they had here in Toowoomba.
Speaking about Toowoomba in particular, what factories were we running in Toowoomba, and what were we responsible for producing?
Well, dairying, first of all, was one of the main producers here in Toowoomba in the first place. So the railway then helped to cut all the products from the dairying industry. But then we went further, and then we were manufacturing things like the workshops to build the locomotives and all that type of thing. So the railway workshops was established in Toowoomba, and that was a big employer of the railways, and they built the windmills and everything that everybody sees on farms today. The windmills started a big manufacturing plant here in Toowoomba by the foundry.
So the Toowoomba foundry actually made trains. Into Toowoomba we were making locomotives.
Yes, we started making the trains here in Toowoomba back in the very late 1800s and into the first part of the 1900s. And it wasn't until they started a contract to build railway wagons that they migrated then, if you like to say, into building locomotives. And overall there were 60 odd locomotives built here in Toowoomba, and so we have one of those that's left now.
Would I be correct in saying that it's the last locomotive that was made, and what year was that one constructed?
It's the only locomotive left that was built by Toowoomba Foundry. It wasn't the last one, because it's one of the very early ones built in 1914, and so it's 100 odd years old now. But it is the last locomotive that was built by the Toowoomba Foundry, which is very significant to Toowoomba itself to have it back home.
And made in 1914, I mean, that's the start of World War One. How did the war impact Australian manufacturing? I mean, do you know any of that history that you could share with us?
It impacted quite a lot, because then a lot of the men were called up to go to war, so a lot of the women folk were called in to take over a lot of the work that the men did, not only just in manufacturing but out on the farms and everywhere else, but particularly in the foundry. It had to be kept going for the war effort to transport goods and freight, and also soldiers and that. So yeah, it sort of worked very well that way.
Oh, and mind you, this is basically an unprepared session, so all of this knowledge is coming basically just straight from your brain, which is very impressive. Do you think that Australia is like less self-sufficient than it should be nowadays?
We probably should be more sufficient in what we're doing and more efficient in what we do. We should be building more of our own things instead of doing it from overseas, but the economic situation and the cost of everything sort of makes a big impact on all that. But the wheel could turn, and we could come back to our own manufacturing, our own petroleum, and all those sort of things that we have lost over the years, and it would be really good to see some of that come back again.
Even in my own generation and in younger generations now, we've seen like the last of the car factories leaving Australia. I think Holden closed its doors in just 2017.
Yeah,
and Ford, yeah. Have you had friends, and have you seen that impact growing up and living throughout that boom of car manufacturing in Australia and seeing it decline? Have you seen some impacts and effects that has had?
I probably haven't seen a lot of impact myself on that, but when you talk to other people, there is a big impact on people that have been involved in that industry, and they've had to now go and find other employment, which isn't so easy when we are losing our manufacturing in that way.
Just speaking from your own life, you've been involved in many businesses and many roles in life. Flickering Flame with,